Welcome to the very first episode of Mutual Exchange Radio, a project of the Center for a Stateless Society. On this podcast, we're going to discuss some of the biggest ideas in the modern anarchist movement. We're bringing in a wide variety of guests, from academics to on-the-ground activists to center scholars to entrepreneurs, to discuss the latest developments in the philosophy and practice of anarchism. Our inaugural guest for the show is Gary Chartier, a distinguished professor of law and business ethics at La Sierra University and a leading anarchist philosopher. He's the author of such books as Anarchy and Legal Order, Law and Politics in a Stateless Society, The Consciousness of an Anarchist, and Radicalizing Rawls Global Justice and the Foundations of International Law. Today, we discuss Chartier's recent move towards formulating a radicalized conception of philosophical liberalism, as he articulates in an essay called Radical Liberalism and Social Liberation, to be published in the forthcoming book, The Dialectics of Liberty, exploring the context of human freedom, edited by Chris Schiavaro, and his draft of his upcoming book, Flourishing Lives, in which he explores liberalism in the tradition of new natural law theory. In this conversation, we cover a broad range of issues, from the evolution of the liberal tradition, to the relationship between anarchism and liberalism, to the limits of ethical theory for politics, and the relationship between various forms of coercion, to how to handle deep religious and moral disagreements in a stateless society, and the relationship between state and corporate power. This is a conversation about what liberalism, the philosophical tradition rather than the existing centrist political movement, could potentially be as a liberating force in politics that it might not yet be in practice. But this is not just a conversation about liberalism. It's a conversation about how moral and cultural discourse can proceed in the absence of a state. So without further ado, here is Gary Chartier. Dr. Chartier, what's an overview of what you mean by radical liberalism and what you want to accomplish?
So, broadly speaking, the liberal political tradition is, you might say, 400 years old or so. And that tradition starts out with probably, there are multiple roots, but we might think about people who are unhappy with monarchy, people who are unhappy with the unification of church and state in Europe, people who see the wars of religion as the predictable results of linking church and state. And then over time, of course, people who become aware of and enthusiastic about markets. And we have a confluence of these and probably some other strands of intellectual history, probably some aspects of the kind of modern scientific mentality, certainly the critical thinking piece of that. And so liberalism really probably comes into its own as the 18th century is concluding, the 19th century is developing. And in the heyday of what we might think of as classical liberalism, in the middle of the 19th century, we dissociate liberalism with free trade and with anti-imperialism, anti-militarism, and so forth. Well, life gets more complicated over time for a variety of reasons, which we can certainly take some time to explore, though I'm a philosopher, not a historian, and I'm sure don't have all the details at my fingertips. But the end result is that, on the one hand, people who think of themselves as, quote, classical liberal come to become increasingly associated with the political right in various ways, while earlier liberals are often identified with radical social movements. We get this association with the right that, again, I think happens for multiple reasons. And at the same time, we get a strand of liberalism that we come to call modern liberalism that really rejects the earlier liberal emphasis, at least to a significant degree, earlier emphasis on things like free trade and individuality and indeed even anti-militarism, and tends to come to use liberal rhetoric to defend state power. In some cases, I think, for pretty dodgy reasons, in some cases for quite understandable reasons related to some problematic social and political conditions that obtain in this period. And so we have, roughly speaking, this kind of divergence in the liberal tradition. At the same time, though, we've got folks who don't fit comfortably into either of those camps that we might call classical and modern liberalism. And I'm thinking here particularly of the individualist anarchists in mid to late 19th century America, though, certainly some other people probably fall into this category, an earlier figure like Thomas Hodgkin, or a later figure, perhaps a later contemporary with these folks, himself not an anarchist, but certainly also a radical and, certainly clearly somebody of the liberal tradition, Henry George. And so what I want to suggest is that approach, a deliberately anarchist, deliberately allied with critical social movements of various kinds, represents the most interesting and fruitful development of the liberal tradition. That's a radical liberal tradition. And also, at least viewed from the most optimistic perspective, really represents a kind of unification or reunification of the two traditions, that it's got the commitment to markets, and also certainly the opposition to militarism and imperialism that's there in the best part of classical liberalism. But it also articulates more clearly than I think a number of the classical liberals did what a genuinely liberal response looks like to some of the problems that might have made modern liberalism look more attractive. And so radical liberalism then tries to really push the liberal tradition to its, if you will, logical conclusions by embracing anarchism, by embracing, something like the anarchism of the 19th century individualist anarchists, and then seeing that in the broader context of liberal theory. I think we can understand liberalism at its best as deeply concerned with diversity, with pluralism, with opportunities for the display of individuality and for social experimentation. And I try to emphasize increasingly in my work how important I think that is as well. So broadly speaking, then, radical liberalism tries to reunify the divergent earlier strands of the liberal tradition. It recognizes anarchism as part of that tradition, as somebody like Chomsky, for instance, would recognize, but sees individualist anarchism of the Benjamin Tucker school as the sort of anarchism that we can focus on to use to unify those traditions, and to really very self-consciously locate that kind of anarchism in relation to broader liberal concerns with diversity, individuality, and pluralism.
So I guess one question that we might be clear on is, what specifically do you think were the reasonable concerns that gave rise to modern liberalism, and how is the radical liberal response to that better and different than what modern liberals say?
Good. So again, I think the story of modern liberalism is complicated. And if we look at, for instance, the progressive movement in the US or its parallel, the Fabian movement in England, a lot of what we see there is technocratic and bureaucratic, and really emphasizes the putative value of expert authority in remaking society like an engineering project. And I think that's deeply troubling, runs into all sorts of problems, both as an assault on liberty, and as an assault on diversity, and as an assault on the capacity for self-organization that human societies in fact have. It assumes far more about the capacity of experts to organize things than I think is at all realistic, and really represents a throwback to what Adam Smith famously criticized as the mentality of the man of system. And I think a lot of the popularity of progressivism in the US did have to do with the appeal both to politicians and to many corporate leaders of big corporations, big businesses in this period, of the idea of managerial expertise being put to work on solving societal problems like engineering challenges. But it's probably the case that the grassroots appeal of some progressive policies and political stances at the same time can be seen as reflective of concerns that people had about, ironically, the rise of really big corporations, and at the same time a perception that the cities were places that were dirty and grimy and full of suffering and vulnerability. And there were worries, of course, about the accommodation of new immigrants and how all that was going to work. There were all of these kinds of social dislocations that I think many people on the ground, probably in many cases upper middle class, Anglo types, various sorts, sort of found these social changes troubling, and they weren't really sure what to do about them. Now, I have no burden as a liberal to defend any desire for a sort of monochromatic society and the desire to impose certain sorts of bourgeois preferences on everybody else. And I do think some of that is behind some progressive concerns. But if you think about the big picture concerns that will have motivated the most, I think, credible ordinary people who were adherents of some modern liberal trends, concerns with the growth and increasing power of big business, concerns with urban poverty, concerns with the diminution of opportunities for self-employment, then I think in those cases, those are concerns that the individualist anarchists and therefore the radical liberalism that I see as a natural outgrowth of an approach that incorporates the concerns of the individualist anarchists can, I think, respond to. Right? So the irony here is that the individualist anarchists, I think, rightly pointed out that many of the concerns that were seen as related to the power of big business that called for, in one way or another, state-driven solutions were problems that really were created, right, by a state preference for these kinds of large business organizations. And so ironically, there's this perception that the state somehow was needed to step in as a source of countervailing power, as if somehow these large business organizations had grown magically on their own, and then needed to be restrained by crusading politicians, when in fact we see, to take the biggest post-Civil War example in the US, the railroads as very much creatures of state power, with huge land grants and other benefits accruing to them. And so it would just be bizarre to see the power of these organizations as somehow limited in one way or another by the state, when in fact they're enabled by the state. At best, what you can imagine is political and business titans sort of jockeying with each other for more power, and one trying to, sort of check the other. But we're not talking about a, somehow spontaneous market development. So what I would say is that the individualist anarchists seem to me to be right in responding to this kind of ironic perception of the need for greater state power by pointing out the various ways in which state intervention, in fact, drives the social developments to which progressivism then is seen as a response.
So, on the other hand, what makes what you see as this radical liberalism truly distinct from classical liberalism?
So, I would say, first of all, it's anarchist. And classical liberalism often seems to be, again, very much a response to states of affairs, immediate development, include concentrated state power. But in general, the classical liberals seem to me to have taken the existing political apparatus largely for granted, with a desire then to tinker with it. Now, you've got people who are much more radical. And so Thomas Hodgkin, whom you'd think of as in the liberal tradition, for instance, but clearly is either an anarchist or close enough that it doesn't matter, and very much wants to challenge both the political order and the kind of economic rules put in place in virtue of that political order. And, on some days of the week, much of the same could be said for his sometime protege, Herbert Spencer, though Spencer, unfortunately, then also sometimes perhaps seems to make the kinds of moves that some other classical liberals do that seem overly accepting of some features of the status quo. So I don't think that classical liberalism as a tradition should be seen as driven by the desire to offer apologetics for the status quo, but I think the unwillingness to challenge the existing political order at its roots does mean that sometimes the commitment to markets and to robust property rights the classical liberals exhibit can look like, and perhaps in some cases is intended as, a bit too much of an apology for existing market arrangements and existing property rights, even if those are rooted in justice. So I think radical liberalism is most importantly distinguished then by its anarchism, but also more broadly by its willingness to ask critical questions about existing social arrangements. And of course, I think at the same time, it's also willing to extend the liberal concern with inclusion and mutual respect and diversity and so forth in ways that might not have initially occurred to some earlier representatives of the classical liberal tradition. So we know that the individualist anarchists, for instance, were in general quite supportive of early feminism and free love. And I think that kind of concern certainly is broadened out among radical liberalism, among proponents of radical liberalism, with certainly concerns for inclusiveness vis-a-vis the social as well as legal status of sexual minorities. And I do think it's important to emphasize that social as well as legal. And that's one reason I find, I should note here, the radical liberal label important. So I have no objection to, indeed I'm quite comfortable with, the label libertarian, but it's become very common for proponents of libertarianism to say libertarianism is a narrowly political view, thus concerned just with legal institutions and the use of force. And what I like about the liberal label is that it makes clear, I think, that there are broader social and cultural concerns with workplace equality, with equality across various kinds of sexual and gender diversity, with inclusiveness vis-a-vis culture and ethnicity and so forth, all these different kinds of ways, and with inclusiveness, and this is especially important and near and dear to my heart, with regard to all sorts of social experimentation. And so some libertarians will say, oh, but we're not concerned about those things. Those aren't narrowly political. I think radical liberalism emphasizes that if you don't like to see people pushed around, that concern doesn't stop when the pushing around no longer involves guns.
We can talk more about the sense in which you talk about radical liberalism as comprehensive in a second, but let's put a pin in that and talk about the label of liberal. So it sounds like you want to maintain the label of liberal to sort of differentiate yourself from these libertarians who see themselves as just concerned with the state and stopping there. Some on the more traditional sort of radical left might push back and say, well, liberalism today has become somewhat synonymous with a centrist ideology of compromise that isn't willing to get to the root of things and is very short-sighted. How do you think, your sort of label, embracing the liberal label, should be differentiated from that concern?
Yeah, so I think that's a very real concern. The great Karl Hess says in the wonderful documentary, if you don't know it, please check it out, Karl Hess Toward Liberty. He says at one point, I've been all sorts of different things, and he lists various things he's been, but one thing I've never been, he says, is a liberal. And what he has in mind there, I think, is clearly just what you're talking about, this idea of liberal as a label for, post-World War II consensus politics and managerial technocracy and, very much inside the Beltway consensus and so forth. And I recognize that is an understandable use of the term. It's clearly become one way in which the term can be used. So I'm probably biased here as a philosopher because philosophers do tend more to talk still about the broad liberal tradition and, to have in mind, the ideas of liberal, philosophers and political theorists. And so there's less tendency, I think, to assume that liberalism just means that sort of, unremarkable mediocre centrism. But I realize that in the broader political context, particularly in the US, I think things are more complicated in Europe, and I think they're liberal, and also in Latin America, I think liberal does have a bit more of the flavor I'm interested in. But in the US, I agree, absolutely, there's the risk of confusion there. And the best I can say, just as with the word anarchist, you find people who say, why do you use the word anarchist? That suggests bomb-throwing radicals who break windows and wear balaclavas and so forth. And I want to say, I think there's a lot more to anarchism than that. So in the same way, I'd want to say with respect to liberalism, by saying radical liberalism, just as by saying anarchism, I recognize there's the risk of confusion and the risk of pushback. And my response is, this is a great pedagogical opportunity. It's a great opportunity to talk about the rich potential of anarchism, the rich potential of the liberal tradition. And by saying radical liberalism in particular, I think I'm putting up a signpost that says we're clearly not talking about the consensus politics that you noted. And indeed, proponents of that sort of view will immediately be stymied, right? Because the very thing that position is not is radical, and it will just seem like a paradox. So let's talk more about why that.
Right. And another thing you noted earlier is that you tend to think of this radical liberalism as in some sense comprehensive, as not just narrowly concerned with sort of like state actors and non-state actors, but like a lot of, not necessarily like the far left people coming from the more quote unquote consensus politics, centrist liberals, they might push back saying, well, yeah, our liberalism is concerned with more than just, state action, but we still want to retain something like a public-private distinction and allow people to experiment in their private lives, not say anything about sort of the private associations of people, but still we're only concerned with the public. So this is not a comprehensive view that implies any like conception of the good or anything. How do you incorporate that type of objection from more traditional liberals, radical liberalism?
Right. So I'm more sympathetic to, if you will, perfectionist than to Rawlsian varieties of liberalism. So that's very much a kind of Rawlsian view, right? That we're not committed to any, rich substantive view of the good. And it's easy to see why that's attractive, given some other assumptions made by many adherents of liberal politics, because the fear clearly is that a broadly perfectionist variety of liberalism is going to involve committing the state, committing law to imposing some vision of the good. And that, of course, is exactly what liberalism in general developed as a response to. That's just the thing that creates the risk of more wars of religion or the equivalent. And so I think that's a very real fear and a very reasonable fear. My view, however, is that a better way to think about this is to see constraints on the use of force as built into the vision of the good that I want to defend. So it's not the case that there's a vision of the good that, boy, I'd really like to impose on people, but for some reason or another, I just can't. It doesn't seem a very liberal thing to do. Instead, I think we can see a genuinely liberal order as precisely an expression of a substantive view of the good, a concern for human flourishing. And so, my own view is that we want something of a kind of broadly Aristotelian variety, and there are different ways that can be worked out. I've got my own preferred way, but I think there are lots of other Aristotelian approaches that are attractive and can involve that kind of positive development. But the way I think about it in general is that if you're concerned about human flourishing, there are aspects of human flourishing, including concerns for autonomy, self-development, self-creation, critical thinking on the one hand, and robust property rights on the other, some other things probably as well, but at least those which place inherent limits on the use of force and thus create something that is in an important sense of public-private distinction. So I don't want to collapse the public-private distinction if that means that the legal system goes everywhere or force goes everywhere. But I also don't want to treat the public-private distinction as unproblematic, because as we know, that's a distinction that's sometimes been used, therefore, to defend not just the importance of not using force with respect to certain kinds of bad behavior, but to treating that bad behavior as not subject to any kind of critique. And of course, sometimes it has actually been used to defend the use of force, right? So, the idea that in patriarchal families, it's okay to, for men to beat women and children and so forth. I mean, we really are talking about the abuse of physical force that's been, in some cases, really underwritten by that distinction. So I want to say we can maintain an important distinction of the kind that liberals are concerned about with public and private. We should see that not as a critical response to or an alternative to a kind of rich, broadly perfectionist liberalism, but precisely as an expression of that.
All right, that seems to make sense. But like this conception of the good is built on a particular vision, and one concern that especially a Rawlsian libertarian or liberal might have is that there's no way like you're going to get a consensus like that vision of the good. So we sort of need to posit this public-private distinction as outside of that conception of the good in order to get public cooperation and public social cohesion to happen, or social cooperation to happen in the first place. What do you think about that line of objection?
Yeah, so it seems to me it's important to distinguish between two things here. It's important to distinguish between what you take to be the case, what you think is the right way to think about things, versus how you can reasonably engage, conversationally with other people. So I think the Rawlsian view often, at least to me, seems to involve the notion that there's something illegitimate about defending views in the public sphere that don't reflect certain kinds of filters, certain kinds of constraints on what can reasonably be said. And I think that with many critics of that sort of Rawlsianism, I'm just unpersuaded by that. It seems to me you can advance in the public sphere, any kind of argument that makes sense to you. That can be an argument that reflects your own convictions. It can also be an ad hominem argument in the sense that you're appealing to assumptions that other people make. I think it's important to be clear about where you're coming from. To say, look, I don't share assumption X, but given that you share assumption X with some other person, it might make sense for you to take a certain view. I think it's all a very ad hoc, messy process of trying to attract people to a particular vision of extended social cooperation. So I certainly don't have the view that somehow we'll all wake up one morning and embrace a particular notion. I mean, it's one of the things that I've always found oddest about certain kind of Rothbardian conception of anarchy, that it just seems as if Rothbard's got the idea that everybody in a society happens to embrace his sort of natural law view. I think it's just bizarre. It's not going to happen, at least certainly not over the course of a few generations. And I think there's no evidence that that's ever very likely. And in the kind of diverse society that I think we have every reason to want, there are going to be varying views. I'm very much aware of that. And I think it's one thing, therefore, to affirm this conception of flourishing. It's another to suppose that that conception of flourishing is going to be the basis on which people accept a set of social institutions. Some people may well find that set of social institutions attractive on the kind of Aristotelian grounds that I or somebody else, Doug Rasmussen, Roderick Long, might want to defend. But other people, I think, are going to find that attractive on other grounds, and that's fine. I'm expecting everybody to agree with me. What I do think, though, is that there are multiple reasons why freedom, individuality, diversity ought to be attractive to people, and it ought to be possible to work toward building a consensus there without thinking, as I think Rawlsians often do, that therefore the possibility of achieving that sort of consensus limits the kinds of views I can hold, or at least the kinds of views I can articulate in the public sphere.
All right, so you don't think that radical liberalism necessarily needs to hinge on any sort of natural law or Aristotelian framework?
I don't think it has to, right? So, I mean, I can imagine somebody defending a broadly radical liberal view on other grounds. As we know, for instance, Tucker himself at least started out as a kind of natural law theorist who then thought, whether he's right or not, that some sort of Stirnerite egoism could do the trick. You can imagine Kantian and utilitarian views that might work this out. And I think there are reasons to criticize Kantian and utilitarian and Stirnerite views, but just as a matter of a practical reality, I certainly think people can affirm views that I like on the basis of assumptions that I might not share, and I might challenge those assumptions. Maybe I'm right, maybe the people holding those assumptions are right, but we might certainly, agree about shared political commitments, even if we find ourselves disagreeing at a deeper level.
All right, so let's transition a bit. So earlier you mentioned that you think some prohibition on force needs to be built into the conception of liberalism that you have. And so can we flesh out exactly what you mean by that, why you think that, and what the...
Well, so I mean, I think to work that out in detail, it would be necessary to have a fully developed kind of moral theory on the table. So let me just say a little about the moral approach that I'd want to take, with the understanding that, this isn't a detour that we have to get lost on. So as I say, my view is broadly Aristotelian, and I've got a lot in common with people, as I suggest, like Roderick Long, like Doug Rasmussen, Doug DeNile. But the new classical natural law view that I'm at any rate inspired by, is particularly reflective of developments in Aristotelianism through Thomas Aquinas, and many of its critics have suggested, I'm not sure this is a bad thing, but in any case, they certainly also see the influence of Kant. So it is in that sense perhaps a kind of hybrid view, somebody might think, rightly or wrongly, that involves both Aristotle and Kant. So my idea is that the right way for us to think about ethics is in terms of well-being. Think about ethics in terms of flourishing and fulfillment or welfare, pick your favorite word there. And that if we think about well-being as central to how we want to make sense of ethics, and that's, I take it, a pretty crucially Aristotelian point, one aspect of well-being that matters is choosing well with respect to how one lives and how one treats other people. And so we don't have, as I think with some modern conceptions over the past, say, 300 or 400 years, we don't have the idea that ethics is a way of thinking about rules of the game, adjudicating conflicts among a bunch of disconnected, atomistic, self-interested actors. But instead, we've got the idea that ethics is about what it is to live a good life, and part of what living a good life involves is living well in relation to other people. It also, though, involves making choices of various kinds, and one aspect of that, it seems to me, is exercising practical reasonableness, exercising our critical faculties. And so one reason, I think, to short circuit lots of conversation we could have about this, one aspect of flourishing that matters, therefore, is this. Thus, I think one aspect of how we function interpersonally is expressing appropriate regard and concern for this capacity for critical judgment, which is consistently bypassed, I think, by the use of force. So that's one reason I think we ought to be concerned about the use of force. Bodily well-being, it seems to me, is an important aspect of our flourishing, and much of the use of force, involves actual or threatened attacks on people's bodily well-being. I'm pretty concerned about that. My own view is different, I think, probably from that of some other people in the Aristotelian libertarian tradition, like my friend Roderick or like Rothbard, in that I'm inclined to want to think differently about property rights than about bodily rights. And so I tend to think the right way to think about property rights is with what I might think of as a sort of souped up Humean approach. I think Hume's kind of justification for property tends to make the most sense. I want to say that as a matter, roughly speaking, of fairness, in light of all the different ways in which a system of robust property rights can contribute instrumentally to our flourishing, we have good reason to individually affirm such rights and to favor institutions that protect them. And institutional actors, probably not individuals, but institutional actors have good reason to treat them as sufficiently reliable that they're basically regarded as exceptionals. You and I might have individual reasons to make exceptions, but a legal system, I think, has good reason to treat them as pretty much exceptionals. So that, too, I think, provides a limit on the use of force. Even if in some ways a squishier one, still I think a pretty strong one. So, I mean, there are other things probably we might want to say, but so another thing I'd want to say is that some justifications for the use of force against bodies and property aren't available. Here I would tend to agree, certainly with libertarians like Roderick Long, like Randy Barnett, that we ought to think about a legal system that's concerned with restitution rather than, as Roderick and I, at least we both want to stress, rather than with retribution, that there are real problems with the idea of retribution and some other kinds of problems with the idea of deterrence. These rationales often serve as excuses for the use of force against people's bodies, and I'd suggest that, and also against their stuff, and I think that's problematic as well. So for at least those reasons, concern with practical reasonableness, the capacity for critical judgment, concern with people's bodily integrity, and concern with property, and also at the same time a rejection of some common rationales for interference with these things. I think all of these provide reasons for us to tightly cabin the use of force.
All right, and there's a lot to delve into there. I guess one thing one should say is, like, what would differentiate sort of like physical harm and the use of physical force from other sorts of non-physical coercive emotion, manipulation or whatever, if you think there is such a distinction.
Well, I think there is a very important distinction. And so I don't think the distinction is that every instance of physical injury is morally more serious than every instance of non-physical injury, right? I mean, stepping on your toe is a minor physical injury. Betraying your friendship is a very serious non-physical injury. So I certainly don't think that there's some sort of lexical ordering so that the physical is always somehow more important. It's just that it's a narrower kind of point that the law, the stock and trade of the law is physical force. And what I'm interested in doing is cabining the use of physical force to cases in which physical force is what's being restrained or responded to. I think that for me is the issue. It's not about talking about what's serious or not serious. It's just saying physical force is, I think, uniquely objectionable in certain ways, insofar as it really constrains people's ability to choose in one way or another, either by actually restraining them or by profoundly threatening their ability to use their own bodies and their own stuff. And it's useful, I think, to limit that kind of physical force, to cases in which physical force is already in place. A kind of proportionality is not quite the right word, but the idea is that there's a useful bright line rule, I think, that says force is a response to force. It's not that that then means other things are okay, other things are legitimate or morally neutral. It just means force is scary. It can easily get out of control. It can really interfere with people's autonomy. Let's try to find a convenient way to limit it. Hey, here's a convenient way to limit it. Force for force.
So for an example, it's morally impermissible to respond to even a very serious form of non-physical harm caused by another person with physical harm caused to them.
That would be my view.
Yeah. Clarifying your view. Mm-hmm. All right. And you mentioned earlier that this was all drawing on neoclassical, new natural law, Gurdjieff, Finis, people like that. That traditionally has been used to justify sort of very traditional ways of looking at things like gender relations, family, a lot of the social things that you have far more leftist views on.
Yes.
What theoretically makes your articulation of neoclassical natural law different from those more orthodox versions of it that derive from sort of like Catholic natural law and stuff like that, that permits you to be truly liberal rather than more of a conservative on those matters?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think there are multiple ways in which I think we can see liberalism as at home in the kind of Aristotelian view I'd want to defend. You're quite right that some other proponents of such views have tended to be, much more socially conservative. They've sometimes, though not always, also tended to be much more politically conservative. Robert P. George, I think, is really a kind of neocon politically in many ways, and certainly would think of his views as pretty conservative across the board. John Finnis, I think, is a kind of communitarian politically. Germain Grisey, who really was the guy who articulated this view, really is the philosophical godfather of the view. Grisey is a little more complicated. That is, I think his own politics did embrace more limits on legal and state power, perhaps, but certainly his own substantive moral views were quite conservative and kind of broadly communitarian. So I would say there's a lot more to be said about this. I have immense respect for the way in which the new natural law theorists have used sort of the modern resources of post-World War II analytic philosophy to articulate a particular version of Aristotelianism that I find in many ways very appealing. I've got a lot of respect for the work that all of those people have done, but I've also spent a lot of my career arguing with them in one way or another. And I guess I would say the arguments come at two levels. So first, I think there's their arguments at, broadly speaking, the political level. So my differences there would include, one, the view that social order can be maintained on a bottom-up basis, the sort of basic anarchist idea. I think the view that the new natural law theorists, in harmony with many earlier theorists in that tradition, going back to Aquinas and really ultimately to Aristotle, tend to have, is that no, indeed, we need the state to provide certain kinds of coordination and to foster various aspects of the human good. And so, first of all, then I challenge that view by defending the live possibility of bottom-up social organization, of spontaneous social order. And so, therefore, that key justification for the state as an entity that then is in a position to go about, enforcing socially conservative mores isn't available. In addition to that, at the political level, I note the importance of, I think, a more robust conception of property rights than new natural law people tend to. So I think that I would build on the justifications for property that they offer, but those justifications, as they understand them in the context of seeing the basic principle of fairness as used to justify an overall property scheme, those understandings really do allow quite a bit of flex and a lot of interference by the legal system. And I try to point out a range of additional factors that might more tightly cabin the possible range of property rules that are reasonable, and therefore I think provide less excuse for a legal system to meddle with people's autonomy in that way. I also think that there's as I say, the difficulty with retribution, which they tend to favor, and which then provides an excuse for a legal system, thus a state legal system, to get involved in punishing people for doing what they take to be morally bad things. I've taken that off the table, at least tried to, by trying to suggest reasons why we might want to reject the idea of retribution. And in the nature of the case, that limits the sort of interference that the political system can engage in. So then I think at the level of ethics, underlying, of course, as I think ethics should do, that state order. Then there's also just, I think, the fact that there are substantive disagreements with their views at various points, and probably the most important of those, of course, have been in the context of sexual ethics. And I've devoted a significant chunk of one book, building on some earlier work that I've done, to explaining why I take the much more liberal positions that I do in sexual ethics, explaining why I think they're about. I don't think we need to start dwelling, for instance, on why they think that non-procreative sex is objectionable, but I spend a fair amount of time trying to discuss that in relation to things like morality. So I think I would make fairly fine-grained distinctions between my view and theirs at the level of ethics and at the level of politics, which then would, I think, lead to options that, while they still, I think, are recognizably part of that broader Aristotelian Thomist tradition, end up, distinguishing my approach from those of socially conservatives.
You also talk about quite a bit the ways in which you think this sort of liberalism can tolerate pluralism of more conservative attitudes and so on. How do you think radical liberals should deal with illiberal communities, illiberal demonstrations, and how do you handle the problem of pluralism, quote unquote problem of pluralism, in your articulation of radical liberalism?
Yeah, so I think that one of the most exciting things about a genuinely liberal vision is the opportunity for people to engage in what John Stuart Mill famously called experiments in living. And, I think about one obvious example here, that of Clarence Jordan's Koinonia Farms in the Red Hills of Georgia in what now seems like a completely different era. The radical, not particularly liberal, Southern Baptist Jordan opens this community that includes various sorts of folks who are not generally welcome in the pre-civil rights era South. So we certainly have people from different ethnic groups working side by side, probably also some New York hippies and so forth, other people who aren't really seen as welcome, pre-hippies, this is probably. The very fact that these people were demonstrating in practical terms their ability to work together and live together peacefully was so disruptive that even though they weren't, attacking, segregationists directly or, holding demonstrations, the simple fact that they demonstrated in practical terms that another way of life was possible made them profoundly threatening and made what Jordan was doing the target for hostile and, I take it sometimes violent activity. Experiments in living of the sort that Mill talked about are, I think, immensely fruitful, both because they allow individuals who are very different from each other to live in ways that work for them, but also because they allow possibilities that might be attractive to others to be put on display. And so I think something like what Nozick talks about in part 3 of Anarchy, State, and Utopia as a utopia of utopias is the kind of thing that a liberal order, I'd hope, could offer. But as you rightly note, that does mean that some people are going to try utopian experiments that really are troublingly, sometimes profoundly illiberal. And I certainly think that liberals shouldn't ignore those. And I think it obviously a lot depends on the kind of specific social arrangements we're talking about, whether, for instance, to what extent they really do involve people who are fully aware and responsible, making choices about, say, for instance, living in some religious hierarchy that I might find problematic and that I think is rooted in mistaken beliefs, but that really might, for them, seem to flow from convictions that they have, versus, what might happen with perhaps a community that's actually seeking to use the autonomy that a free society would offer to be positively violent, let's say, toward children. And we can imagine, a whole continuum of possibilities there. What I would say primarily, though, is when there really does seem to be violence and people are actively appealing for help against that violence, or pretty clearly would do so if they weren't being repressed. I think it's not at all inappropriate for targeted, rescue efforts to take place. When you're talking instead about ideologically problematic but nonviolent communities, then I think it's entirely appropriate to engage in critical dialogue with folks there. I don't think that a utopia of utopias and a live and let live attitude means I ignore what's going on elsewhere. So it still, I think, is going to be appropriate for liberals who embrace the sort of comprehensive liberal doctrine that I would want to favor, or some other comprehensive liberal doctrine, to engage in critical dialogue with folks there. What I would not want to do, I guess, is to further that critical dialogue in a way that says, I guess broadly speaking, I'm going to treat you in an illiberal fashion. I'm not going to make you feel welcome. I'm certainly going to provide space for escape from people who want to get out of such communities. We can easily imagine, even when a community is nonviolent, somebody feeling really kind of trapped there and saying, I really want to get out. And I certainly hope liberals would welcome such people and help them to land, as it were. But where the people really, I think, embrace even, what I think of as basically false consciousness, then I think we've got to be careful about that. So the notion of false consciousness, I think, can be really patronizing, and the risk is always that I then start to actively interfere because I think you aren't entitled to your sense of the world, and I think that's rightly a source of resentment. That's why I'm going to keep talking about critical dialogue, which I think is a respectful way of engaging with people, whose views, I think might be stultifying in one other. So I guess I don't have any simple good solution here. A lot depends on where along this continuum of illiberality a given community falls. I want to see a range of ways of life put on display. Indeed, I've often thought that a fun sort of piece of anarchist propaganda would be a set of mystery novels set in a world with all sorts of different communities like this, with a central character who's sort of exploring those different ways of being by solving crimes in those different communities. I think that display is really important, but I think liberals shouldn't forget about the ways in which that can also be deeply problematic. That, talking about respecting a community too easily can run the risk of meaning respecting the dominant actors in that community, who in one way or another then are sidelining or subjugating other people, all too frequently women and children, but again, even outside of that context, this can happen. So there's a dialectical dance. I don't have a simple answer. I want people to value pluralism and at the same time be critical.
So let's take a more specific example of a highly illiberal community with, someone who might have that false consciousness. So let's say there's a highly religious community. It doesn't have to be like predominantly powerful religion in the West. It could be, Islamic community. It could be a traditional Catholic community. And there's an individual in such a community who is, homosexual and has embraced this sort of false consciousness of having it. And that community promotes this narrative around homosexuality that's highly illiberal, highly, this is wrong. So like your response to that would merely be like critical dialogue with them about the morality of homosexuality.
Yeah, so I would say it's three things, right? So it's critical dialogue with the sort of the dominant players in the city. It's actively, reaching out to, let's say, this particular person who, is experiencing, we may assume, some tension related to, the difference between self-identity on the one hand and desire, and on the other, the expectations of the community. And then also, I hope, providing personal or institutional, landing pads if somebody like that says, I don't see a way of reforming this community. You've convinced me that these views are deeply destructive and I want to get out. I think it's important to recognize how difficult that can be, both logistically and psychologically. And so I would hope that there would be liberal, both
homeless shelters being an example, stuff like that.
I'm sorry, didn't you talk?
LGBT homeless shelters being an example. And stuff
yes, yes, yeah.
All right, let's take another example where it's not so much a community as a demonstration. So you say like publicly shaming people and publicly, going after people who do not cohere with your views is something that you don't think is very wise or prudent or whatever. First, well, let's go into why you think that before we get to a more specific example of what this view would imply.
So I guess ultimately, so when I wrote Anarchy and Legal Order a few years ago, I think I relied on the notion that one way in which nonviolent order maintenance could happen certainly would be through the use of things like public shaming. Over time, I guess I've just observed since then too many uses of that sort of technique that involve, as it seems to me, Twitter mobs are the equivalent, descending pretty uncritically on people and attacking them and sidelining them. And part of my deep embrace of liberalism is that I want a community where people feel welcome. And I certainly, therefore, want to protect those who are made to feel unwelcome by illiberal ideas. But I also don't want to see the defense of liberal ideas carried out in a way that effectively then makes people unnecessarily feel unwelcome. Obviously, if you're deeply violent, you may have to be restrained. You might even have to be subjected to violence yourself, and that can certainly be in one way or another exclusionary. I'm not trying to draw really bright lines here, but I think that as a matter of both valuing inclusion and as a matter of respecting people's capacity to make decisions based on, intellect and imagination rather than on fear, I'd really like to see the sorts of social pressure that largely depend on excluding and subordinating people really minimized as much as possible, so that instead challenges to illiberal ways of life would be in using mechanisms that appeal to reason and imagination much more. And I emphasize imagination because I think clearly one thing you can do, I think literature and film and so forth.
Sentimental education.
Yeah, that's right.
Let's make this more concrete. So like one use of shaming is in like anti-fascist praxis. So, you find out some individual went to some Nazi demonstration or something like that. Mm-hmm. You go out, you expose that to his employer or her employer, whatever, and then the employer fires him because you've done this whole sort of public way of exposing that they're Nazi. Do you think that's a legitimate use of shaming or an illegitimate one? And where would we draw the line for when it becomes illegitimate?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I think people should have the right to do that.
Right. This is about moral permissibility now.
But I'm personally pretty uncomfortable with it. I think that, I just think that in effect, using employers to enforce moral norms that don't relate to the immediate context of employment bothers me. Now, so let's be clear then. We can imagine a situation in which, let's say, someone is working in a setting in which that person really is in a position to be, perhaps say quite abusive to members of ethnic minority groups, and then we discover that this person is affiliated with a racial supremacist organization. Then I start to think that becomes more relevant because it really does say you're entrusting this person with a kind of responsibility that we can expect this person might well abuse. That's a bit different. But if it's just a matter of saying this person behaved wrongly, this person embraces both false beliefs and bad attitudes that don't directly impact work performance, then I think just exposing that person and hoping that an employer will punish that person bothers me, in part because I don't like punishment in the first place as a moral.
Right. So, like, for an example, if the person in question were a university administrator over students of color or something like that, then it would be okay. But if it's just like a hot dog cashier or something like that, then it wouldn't be.
Well, I mean, I guess I would say, look, so maybe the hot dog cashier noticeably has a pattern of behavior of, insulting, people of color. And then we find out that, there's this other association. Now, what I'd like, I think, would be to say in the case where that person has been abusive, I would hope the employer wouldn't need this extra piece of evidence about, attendance at a Nazi rally. The person could just say, this person isn't treating people well, and that's both morally problematic and bad for business. Mm-hmm. So the only time it seems, and maybe, now, maybe this is an employer who also favors abusive conduct. That's another matter. But assuming that's not the case, then it seems as if we're only talking about this as an issue where the person hasn't, in fact, engaged in some independently identifiable instance of discriminatory conduct. And so that's the kind of case I'm worried about. You note the case, where somebody might really be, you're the vice chancellor for diversity someplace, and you're really expected to promote inclusion, but it really turns out you're a bigot. Then I think it's probably entirely appropriate for you not to be in that position. But what I don't want is a situation in which, normally speaking, you haven't put on display what seem like subordinative or exclusionary traits, and then you're being punished because it turns out that you have those attitudes that might underlie those. Those aren't great attitudes. I oppose them. I think they ought to be challenged. But I'm nervous about saying, therefore, we're going to get you fired.
Speaking of employers, so you mentioned, Earl, like right at the beginning, that one thing that distinguishes this form of liberalism from classical liberalism or modern liberalism is it takes a more critical stance towards centralized firms and the ways they treat workers and so on, right?
Right.
You mentioned that you view the rise of that corporate power as more a function of the state centralizing things during the Gilded Age and so on. And you think that, like, sort of if we undo all that, then you will have less centralized firms and therefore more self-autonomy, more ability for self-employment for workers, and so firms could be less restrictive over control over their employers' lives, right? What if it turned out that that's not enough? What if it turned out that economies of scale were such that centralized firms occur anyways, employers would need to join the markets, or employers would need to work for these firms, and in a fully freed market, firms could still control employers and their private lives and so on in these morally problematic ways? Like, that seems to be what, for an example, Liz Anderson thinks, recent book, Private Government. But.
Right. Yeah, so, and obviously, this is, at least in significant part, an empirical question.
Right.
It's difficult, for us to know. So, one thing that I try to do, especially in my first book on these topics, Economic Justice and Natural Law, is to talk about why this should not be seen just as a matter of preference, but as a genuinely moral issue. I try to lay out a bunch of reasons why, I suppose, two kinds of things particularly matter: why due process at work matters, and why decentralization at work matters from a moral standpoint. I think that it does seem likely to me that we'd see real improvements without the existence of state props to centralization. But even if things went rather better than Liz suspects they might, I'm sure we'd still see, even in my preferred world, one in which sometimes employers ignored market pressures to treat workers better and self-employment options weren't available, and you had really abusive employers who perhaps got off on that. I think that what that highlights is that it does seem really important for various sorts of suasion to take place. And so I think Charles Johnson has rightly highlighted this in an essay that appears under different titles, but in our collection, Markets Not Capitalism, he calls "We Are Market Forces." And Charles's point, I take it, is that there's sort of impersonal market pressure, but if we understand the market, as he suggests we should, to mean the broad space of consensual interaction, so that the cash nexus really is just a subset of that, then I think we have to say that even in the utopia of utopias, where individual employers are assholes, there is every reason for us to contribute in one way or another to efforts at both intra-firm and public pressure, on these employers to take seriously what I think are genuine moral concerns, again, about decentralization and about due process. So the best I can do, I don't have a panacea, because I do really think that even in an ideal world, you'd see some bad behavior in the workplace, is just to say that, one, removing the props, I think, does make a significant difference, but two, we have to be prepared to contribute to and support in various ways efforts to challenge bad behavior on moral grounds when it occurs, when it turns out to be the case that the change in the institutional environment has been.
And what would those efforts look like yellow journalism and wildcat unionism, boycotts, stuff like that?
And yeah, I think public exposure of that kind of the kind of bad conduct that's involved.
Do you think that's in danger of running into a sort of shame-based thing that you object to in other contexts, or?
Sure, I think it's in danger of that. I think you're always walking a tightrope there. You don't have a magic solution. I think that you can expose bad behavior and say, let's challenge the bad behavior directly. I'm not saying that by advancing that response, I'm not, maybe sometimes I'm going to be encouraging a kind of public shaming that makes me uncomfortable. I don't have a set of rules for people to follow, and we're finding our way in the dark, and sometimes we're going to be better at it than others. But some kinds of public pressure, I'm quite confident, can be defended.
One last question. I'm sort of stealing this from Ezra Klein because I think it's a good way to end a podcast. Sure. Is what are 3 books you've read that have been particularly influential over your way of thinking about these issues or more generally?
Wow. Okay. So the broad theoretical position, the version of new natural law theory that I embrace, I first discovered courtesy of John Finnis's Natural Law, Natural Rights. I think that's a book with which I've got any number of disagreements, but I think it's a really fine book and really helped me to start thinking about ethics and political philosophy and legal philosophy in a way. So that's certainly important. I think thinking about the corporate issues that we were just talking about, I might identify Kevin Carson's organization theory as having been tremendously eye-opening for me. And that was really, Kevin was working on that book. It was just showing up online in pieces as I first became aware of his work and of the other folks at C4SS. And it was really that book, probably as much as anything, that made it to step back into libertarianism by articulating a kind of radical left libertarianism that I could find appealing. Another book which, I have to admit, I should have read much more of than I have, but which I think really articulates a kind of vision that I'd want to defend here, is Shirley Mills on Liberty.
Who J.S. Mills?
Yes.
Yeah. It's a great book. Well, thank you so much for doing this. I think this was a good first episode, great conversation, and I hope to see you write more for the Center and maybe have you on in a future episode.
I'd love to be on again, and writing op-eds for the Center is always fun. It's not something I do as frequently as I might, but your gentle reminder is very much appreciated. Thank you for this time.
Yeah, take care.